The wind was not a sound, it was a weight. It pressed against the cabin walls with a physical, malicious force, searching for any crack or seam. Elias Thorne felt it in the bones of the structure he had built with his own hands. Outside, the world had vanished into a shrieking vortex of white. The air itself had turned to razors, so cold it seared the lungs. He shoved the last of the split pine into the stable section of his shelter, his breath pluming and freezing instantly on his beard. "Easy, boy," he murmured. His horse, Copper, shifted nervously, his large, intelligent eyes wide with instinctual fear. The animal knew this was no ordinary blizzard. This was a killer. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in the hour since sunset, and it was still falling. Elias gave the horse a final, reassuring pat on the neck. He checked the water trough. It was already filming over with ice, despite being inside the sheltered walls. There was no more time. He moved from the stable area through a thick, insulated door into the main part of his home. He did not go up into the small log cabin that sat atop the structure. That was a trap. That was a place for dying. Instead, he went down. A heavy trapdoor in the floor opened onto a steep flight of stone steps. He descended into the earth, the roar of the wind diminishing with each step. At the bottom, he entered a small, stone-lined room. It was his bunker, his sanctuary, his folly. He lit a lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the subterranean dark. Then he reached up, grasped the thick iron rings on the underside of the trapdoor, and pulled it shut. A second, heavier slab of insulated wood slid into place below it. He shot 2 thick iron bolts. The silence that followed was profound. The storm, which a moment before had been a physical assault, was now a distant, muted hum. A vibration felt through the soles of his boots. He was sealed inside the earth. He and Copper were safe. As the first tremor of a cracking tree shuddered through the bedrock, he wondered if anyone else would be. 6 months earlier, he had stood in the office of the Gallatin County Surveyor, a place that smelled of dry paper and self-importance. Mr. Davies, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, peered down at the meticulously drawn plans spread across his desk. He adjusted his spectacles, his lips pursed in a mixture of confusion and contempt. "Let me be clear, Thorne," Davies had said, tapping a soft finger on the cross-section drawing. "You want a permit to build a cabin, standard enough, but you intend to bury 3/4 of it." "Not bury it," Elias corrected, his voice calm and even. "I intend to berm it, using the earth I excavate for the foundation and the cellar." "A cellar?" Davies scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This isn't a cellar. This is a tomb. It's 10 feet deeper than any root cellar needs to be, lined with stone, with a separate ventilation shaft. And this earth berming, you'll rot your logs inside of 5 years. The moisture, man, the moisture." Elias had heard this before. He had tried to explain it to the men at the lumber mill, to the clerk at the general store. He tried again. "The logs won't touch the earth. There will be a stone foundation, a full foot of clearance, and a waterproof barrier of tarred hide and clay. The earth provides insulation. It provides a windbreak. Its temperature stays constant, around 50 degrees, year-round. It's a thermal battery." Davies leaned back, a smug smile on his face. He looked at Elias as one might look at a peculiar child. "Thorne, I know your history. Cavalry scout. Lived with the Crow for a time, they say. That's all well and good for chasing down renegades in the dust. But this is 1886. We have sawmills that can cut a board to a 1/16 of an inch. We have cast iron stoves that can heat a ballroom in an hour. We have science. We don't live in holes in the ground anymore. I've seen a winter on the high plains that can freeze a running man solid before he hits the ground, Elias stated plainly. I've heard the stories from the old trappers about the year the rivers froze to the bottom. I've watched the signs this summer, the low nests of the magpies, the thickness of the beaver dams, the way the elk moved down to the valleys a full month early. Something is coming. Something our new science hasn't seen before. The surveyor laughed. It was not a kind sound. Folklore and animal superstition. Build your cabin, Thorn. A standard cabin. I'll approve that. But this madness. The county won't sanction a man digging his own grave. Elias had calmly rolled up his plans. I don't need the county's sanction. The land is mine. I'll build it myself. He had walked out of the office, the surveyor's laughter following him down the hall. The story was all over the small settlement of Prospect Creek by nightfall. Thorn's Folly, they started calling it. Thorn's Tomb. When he bought blasting powder for the excavation, the whispers said he was hurrying the process of his own burial. He paid them no mind. Their ridicule was a thin and distant sound, like the chirping of crickets. The wind he was preparing for would be much, much louder. The work began at dawn the next day. He did not hire a crew. He had only his own 2 hands, a set of well-cared-for tools, and copper. The horse was his partner in the labor, a steady, silent presence whose trust was worth more than the approval of 100 townsfolk. First came the excavation. He marked out the footprint of the cabin and the deeper bunker adjacent to it. He used a heavy plough to break the sod, then hitched Copper to a slip scraper. It was brutal, repetitive work. The scraper blade would bite into the soil. Elias would lift the handles to fill the bucket, and Copper would lean into his harness, dragging the load of earth to a designated pile that grew into a small mountain. The townspeople who rode by on the main track would sometimes stop and watch, shaking their heads. They saw a fool digging a hole. Elias saw the walls of his fortress rising from the ground. He dug until he hit the granite shelf that underlay the entire valley. This was his floor. It was uneven, but it was solid. It was the bone of the world. For weeks, he worked with a star drill and a sledgehammer, chipping and leveling a flat surface, his entire body aching with a satisfying fatigue by nightfall. Then came the stone. His 160 acres were littered with glacial till, smooth, hard stones of every size, deposited by the ice sheets of a forgotten age. He built a stone boat, a heavy wooden sled, and day after day he and Copper hauled tons of rock from the far corners of his property. He became a connoisseur of stone, judging each one by its shape, its weight, its integrity. He needed flat-faced stones for the walls, heavy foundation stones for the corners, and smaller chinking stones to fill the gaps. The walls of the bunker rose first. He was a master of dry stack construction, a skill learned from an old prospector in the Bighorn Mountains. He laid the stones without mortar, fitting them together like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Each stone was placed so its weight locked the ones below it. The walls were 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the top. When they were complete, he mixed a slurry of clay from the creek bed and chopped straw, forcing it into every remaining crevice from the inside. The result was a set of walls that were airtight, immensely strong, and deeply connected to the thermal mass of the surrounding earth. He built the cabin's foundation next, upon which the log structure would sit. He laid massive, flat-topped stones, leveling them with painstaking precision. This was the part the townsfolk understood, yet they still mocked the sheer scale of it. "Building a fort, Thorn?" Jacob Miller, his nearest neighbour, had called out one day, a smirk on his face. "Expecting an attack?" "Of a kind," Elias had replied, not looking up from his work. He felled the trees himself, selecting mature lodgepole pines from a high ridge. He used a two-man crosscut saw, working one handle himself, the other end weighted and rocking in a rhythm he had perfected over years. He and Copper dragged the logs down to the building site, the air filled with the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. He peeled the bark with a draw knife, then set to scribing and fitting the logs. Each notch was a custom fit, carved with an axe and chisel until the logs sat together so tightly a knife blade could not be slipped between them. The cabin itself was a simple affair, one large room with a sleeping loft above. But its construction was unique. The north and west walls, the ones that would face the prevailing winter winds, were built double thick, and as they rose, the true purpose of the mountain of excavated earth became clear. He began the berming. Using the slip scraper again, he moved the earth back, piling it against the thick stone foundation, then up against the log walls themselves. He packed it down, layer by layer. By the time he was done, the cabin appeared to be sinking into a smooth, grass-covered hill of his own making. The north and west walls were almost completely covered, right up to the eaves of the roof. The structure did not fight the landscape. It joined it. The roof was the final piece of the puzzle. He laid heavy log rafters, topped them with thick, rough-sawn planks. Over this, he stretched a layer of buffalo hides he'd traded for, treating them with a mixture of pine tar and tallow until they were waterproof. Then came the most unusual part. He built a low wooden retaining wall around the edge of the roof and filled the entire surface with a foot of soil. He planted it with the same tough prairie grasses he'd used on the berm. In the spring, it would be a living roof. In the winter, it would catch and hold the snow, which he knew was one of the greatest insulators in nature. A roof of snow a few feet thick would hold the heat in better than any shingle. The central chimney was his masterpiece. It was a massive column of stone rising through the center of the structure, containing two separate flues. One served the large fireplace in the main cabin, the other ran down to the bunker, where a small, efficient cast-iron stove was installed. The stone of the chimney would absorb heat from both fires, radiating it slowly and evenly throughout the entire structure, above and below ground. It was the warm, beating heart of his home. By late autumn, as the aspens turned to gold and the air grew crisp, the work was done. He spent his days stockpiling. The bunker had a dedicated room for firewood, stacked floor to ceiling. Shelves groaned with sacks of flour, beans, and salted meat. He filled barrels with oats for Copper. He had enough to last the two of them through the cruelest winter imaginable. He was ready. The mockery from the town had faded to a low, persistent hum of pity. He was no longer a fool, but a madman, a hermit who had entombed himself on the hillside. He saw it in their eyes when he rode into Prospect Creek for salt or coffee. They gave him a wide berth. They spoke in hushed tones. Their children sometimes dared each other to run up and touch the grassy walls of his strange home. He did not mind the isolation. He preferred the silent company of the mountains. He began to see the signs he had been watching for. Small, subtle shifts in the rhythm of the world. The jet stream, which normally painted the sky with high, feathery cirrus clouds, now left strange, greasy-looking bands of iridescent light at sunset, a phenomenon the old ones called sundogs, a portent of deep cold. The squirrels, normally chattering and bold, vanished. They were deep in their nests, living off the frantic stockpiling he had witnessed in late summer. The usual winter birds, the juncos and the chickadees, were also gone. The silence in the forest was unsettling. The temperature fluctuations became extreme. One afternoon would be mild, almost warm, the sun feeling good on his face. But the moment the sun dipped below the peaks, the temperature would plummet, and a hard, killing frost would encase every blade of grass by morning. The land could not breathe. It was holding its breath, waiting. Copper felt it most keenly. The horse, normally placid and calm, grew restless. He would pace in his stall, his ears twitching, his nostrils flared as if tasting some foulness in the wind. Elias would stand with him, running a hand down his powerful neck, feeling the tension in the animal. He trusted the horse's senses more than any barometer. Copper was a creature of the earth, and the earth was sending a warning. Then, on a dead calm afternoon in late November, it came. Elias was splitting the last of a large pine round when he felt it. Not a sound, but a change in the pressure of the air. A sudden, profound stillness. He looked up at the sky. A solid, gray lid had slid into place from horizon to horizon. There was no texture to it, no definition. It was the color of lead. He looked toward the north. On the far horizon, above the jagged peaks of the Bridger Range, a dark line was visible. It was not a cloud. It was a wall, a bruise of deep indigo against the gray sky. And it was moving toward him with unnatural speed. He dropped his axe. "Copper!" he called out, his voice sharp. He ran for the stable. The horse was already agitated, stamping his hooves. Elias didn't waste time with the saddle. He secured the last of his supplies, checked the water barrel, and threw the heavy bar across the stable door. He worked with a calm urgency he had learned long ago. Panic was a luxury you could not afford when survival was on the line. He moved into the main cabin, closing the heavy shutters over the two small windows. He laid a fire in the hearth, but did not light it. The cabin was for later. The bunker was for now. He pulled open the trapdoor, and a waft of cool, earthy air rose to meet him. The first gust of wind hit the house. It was not a whistle. It was a physical blow, a solid impact that made the thick log walls groan. The temperature inside the cabin dropped 10 degrees in an instant. This was it. The thing he had prepared for. The thing they had all dismissed as a madman's dream. He descended the stone steps, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He slid the bolts home. The roar of the storm was instantly cut off, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of the earth. He lit the small stove in the corner of the bunker. The kindling caught at once, and a cheerful crackle filled the small space. He sat on a stool, the lantern light casting a warm glow on the stone walls. He could feel the storm's fury as a low-frequency vibration through the granite floor. He could hear the occasional, deep, cracking boom as ancient trees, frozen, brittle, surrendered to the wind. But inside his shelter, it was calm. It was safe. The stone walls, which had been slowly absorbing the Earth's 50-degree temperature for months, now began to absorb the heat from the stove. The air was still and warm. The principle of thermal mass was at work. It was not folklore. It was physics. Through a tiny, triple-paned glass port he had set in the eastern wall, a salvaged ship's porthole, he could see a sliver of the outside world. It was a maelstrom of driving ice and snow. Far down the valley, he saw the flickering light of a lamp in the window of the Miller house. Jacob Miller, his wife, and their 2 young children. They had a new house, built with modern balloon framing techniques, thin walls, and large, fashionable windows. They had laughed the loudest at his hobbit hole. He watched the light. It seemed to shrink, to grow weaker, as if being consumed by the vast, predatory cold. Then it flickered violently and went out. A profound and terrible darkness swallowed the valley. Elias knew what that meant. The single-pane glass in their windows would have spiderwebbed and shattered from the thermal shock. The wind would now be inside their house. Their stove, no matter how much wood they fed it, would be fighting a losing battle against an entire Arctic air mass. Their house was no longer a shelter. It had become a sieve. For 2 hours he sat in the quiet warmth, listening to the muffled sounds of the world being torn apart above him. He felt a deep sense of sorrow, but no surprise. He had tried to warn them, and they had answered with mockery. He had built for reality, and they had built for fashion. Nature, he knew, did not care about fashion. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the low hum of the storm. A frantic, desperate banging. It was coming from above, from the main cabin door. The sound was muffled by the earth and the heavy trapdoor, but it was unmistakable. He stood up, his heart pounding. To be out in this was a death sentence. To have survived long enough to reach his door was a miracle. He unbolted the trapdoor and pushed it open. The cold that cascaded down the stairwell was a living thing. It was a solid presence that stole his breath. The roar of the wind filled the space. He climbed the steps into the cabin. The room was already intensely cold, frost forming on the interior walls. The banging on the main door was louder now, weaker. He pulled back the heavy iron bars that secured the door and wrenched it open. A figure, a shapeless mound of snow and ice, fell inward, collapsing onto the floor. Behind him, 2 smaller figures were huddled together, with another adult struggling to hold them up. It was Jacob Miller. His face, where it was visible through a thick crust of ice, was a mask of sheer terror and disbelief. "Thorn," Miller gasped, his voice a raw croak. "Help us! For God's sake, help us!" Elias didn't waste words. He pulled Miller inside, then helped his wife, Sarah, who was half carrying their 2 children. The children were frighteningly still, their faces pale. He slammed the door against the storm and shot the bolts. "The house," Miller stammered, his body racked with violent shivers. "The windows blew out. It's as cold inside as out. The fire, it just sucks the air out. We couldn't breathe." "Down," Elias said, his voice firm, pointing to the open trapdoor. "Quickly." He herded the terrified family down the stone steps, into the warmth and stillness of the bunker. The change was so abrupt, it was dizzying. They had stepped from a howling, lethal hell into a pocket of profound peace. Sarah Miller sank to the floor, pulling her children close, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jacob Miller just stood there, looking around at the stone walls, the neatly stacked firewood, the gentle light of the lantern. He was looking at the tomb he had mocked for an entire season. He was looking at salvation. Elias handed them thick wool blankets and ladled hot broth from a pot simmering on the stove. The warmth returned to their limbs slowly. The little girl began to cry, a thin, weak sound. Her brother was silent, his eyes wide with shock. "We saw Davies," Miller said after a long silence, his voice trembling. "The surveyor. He was on his horse, trying to get to town. Trying to warn people, I think. The wind, it took him. The horse went down. We couldn't see any more after that." Elias nodded grimly. He had known Davies was a fool, but he had not thought him a suicidal one. The man of science had put his faith in his instruments, and they had likely betrayed him. underestimating the sheer ferocity of what was coming. For 3 days, the storm raged. The sun did not rise. There was only a grey, twilight gloom that filtered through the screaming snow. Inside the bunker, life settled into a quiet routine. Elias tended the stove, prepared simple meals, and checked on Copper through a small, connecting passage he had built. The horse was calm, secure in his well-insulated stall. The Millers slept, huddled together, their bodies slowly recovering from the trauma of the cold. Jacob Miller rarely spoke. He just watched Elias, his eyes filled with a dawning, painful understanding. He had mistaken wisdom for madness, and his family had almost paid the price for his ignorance. On the morning of the 4th day, a new kind of silence fell. The deep, vibrating hum of the wind was gone. Elias climbed the steps and cracked open the main door. He was met by a wall of snow. He pushed, and the snow gave way with a soft hiss. He stepped outside into a world remade. The sun was brilliant in a sapphire blue sky, and the light it cast on the new landscape was blinding. Everything was covered in a thick, sculpted layer of wind-driven snow and ice. It was beautiful and terrible. The air was still, and so cold it felt like a pane of glass against his skin. Trees were snapped in half, their frozen wood shattered like matchsticks. There was no sign of life, no bird calls, no animal tracks, just a profound, crystalline silence. The Miller house was a ruin. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were coated in a thick, surreal layer of hoarfrost. It looked like a photograph of a house, not a real one. "We have to get to town," Miller said, his voice quiet. Elias saddled Copper. They rode out, the horse's hooves crunching through the styrofoam-like snow. The journey to Prospect Creek, normally an hour's ride, took 3. The devastation was absolute. Houses stood like hollowed-out ice sculptures. Barn roofs had caved in, and the frozen shapes of livestock were visible beneath the wreckage. They found the survivors in the wreckage of the general store. Its thick sod roof had held, though its large front windows had shattered. Perhaps a dozen people were huddled inside, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they could find, their faces gaunt and stunned. Mr. Davies, the surveyor, was among them. He was alive, but his hands and feet were blackened with severe frostbite. When Davies saw Elias walk in, a look of profound shame crossed his face. He struggled to his feet, leaning on the shoulder of another man. The small crowd fell silent. "Thorne," Davies said, his voice cracking. "You were right." He took a ragged breath. "We were arrogant. We were fools. We called you mad. But you were the only sane man in this whole valley." He looked from Elias to the other survivors. "This man tried to tell us. I laughed at him. We all did. And now we've paid for it." The apology, delivered in the frozen ruins of their town, was complete. The vindication was absolute. Elias felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction in being right. He felt only a deep, aching sadness for the lives that had been lost, for the hard lesson that had been delivered with such brutal finality. In the weeks that followed, the survivors of the Great Freeze of '86 began to rebuild. But they did not rebuild as they had before. They came to Elias Thorne, one by one, their faces humbled. They did not ask for food or charity. They asked for knowledge. He taught them. He took them to his home and showed them the principles of his folly. He explained thermal mass, the way the earth holds its heat. He showed them how to build a berm to deflect the wind, how a sod roof could turn the snow from an enemy into an ally. He taught them how to build with stone, to respect the old ways, to listen to the land. They listened not with skepticism, but with the rapt attention of students who had survived a final, terrible exam. 20 years passed. Prospect Creek was reborn, but it was a different town. The houses no longer stood tall and exposed on the valley floor. They were nestled into the hillsides, their north walls made of thick stone, their roofs green with grass in the summer. They were sturdy, humble structures, built not for show, but for survival. The whole town was a testament to Thorne's method. Elias became a quiet legend, a respected elder whose wisdom was sought on all matters, from planting crops to predicting the weather. His home, once known as Thorne's Folly, was now just called the Hill House, a place of sanctuary. It had sheltered townsfolk through 2 more harsh winters, never failing them. His methods had spread to neighboring valleys, becoming the standard for building in the high country. Copper, his loyal partner, had lived out a long and peaceful life, and was buried on a rise, overlooking the house he had helped to build. Sometimes Elias would stand at the grave marker and look out at the rebuilt valley, at the homes built to withstand the worst the world could throw at them. He had learned a simple, profound truth. The community had mistaken foresight for madness because they had placed their faith in things that were new and clever. They had forgotten the ancient, hard-won wisdom of the earth itself. They had believed their modern tools and thin walls made them superior to nature, when in fact it had only made them more vulnerable. They had learned, at a terrible cost, that the greatest shelter is not the one that stands against the world, but the one that makes itself a part of it. The wind still blew, the winters still came, but the people of Prospect Creek were no longer afraid. They were prepared. They were home.